Good morning. Instead of being in front of my computer this morning typing the Sunday letter, I'm here in front of Corn Hall to launch the first of a series of events to commemorate Frederica Academy's 50th anniversary. So actually tomorrow, 50 years ago, August 31st, 1970, Frederica Academy opened its doors in old downtown Brunswick Hospital to 108 students. So today, 50 years later, Frederica Academy is still fulfilling its mission of offering a college preparatory school to numerous children throughout the Golden Isles. Today, I have two esteemed members of the Frederica Academy community joining me. James Cruikshank, who is a senior and student body president, and Dewey Benefield, one of the original founders of the school and the resident expert in early life at Frederica Academy. Dewey has been here supporting the school actively since his son Jim was the first student credited with being at Frederica Academy, and now last spring with his granddaughter Catherine graduating and moving on to the University of Georgia. I'm delighted to have both of them here. I think you'll enjoy this video performance. James, whenever you're ready.
Mr. Benefield, I sit with you here today to commemorate 50 years since the beginning of Frederica Academy on August 31st, 1970. It's a privilege for me to have the opportunity to speak to you and to be a part of this community. It fosters a lot of growth, a lot of love, and a lot of success moving into the field of adulthood. And I want to start this conversation mentioning your wife, Tiggy. If it had not been for her, really, we might not even be having this conversation. And I was hoping you could elaborate on how she kind of got the ball rolling for Frederica, how she got the idea planted in your head.
Well, she was a remarkable lady. She had taught school for some years before we were married, and she was super organized, and she became concerned about the quality of our education that our son was getting. And she said, it's just not like it ought to be. And in the past, she had been pushing for a middle school on St. Simon's, so people wouldn't have to go to Brunswick, the middle school. And I think she even went before the Board of Education, but they turned her down. So, meantime, there had been several attempts by local parents to start a school. And what would happen, they'd have a consultant come in, and he'd listen to them and they'd listen to him, and he'd say, well, yeah, it's a great idea, and you get together about $250,000 as a base, and I believe you can get started. Well, that ended that discussion, because in those days, that was a lot of money. None of us had much money, so money was a problem. So Tiggy said, well, we'll just do it ourselves. And I said, okay. Now, if you're married to a school teacher, you don't usually argue with them much. You just say, okay.
I wouldn't imagine.
And I had no idea what we were getting into, but she felt very strongly about it. She had been meeting with some other ladies, and they felt strongly about it. So I said, okay, we'll do this thing. So we began to have meetings at our house and decided that we would split up. She would be in charge of sort of recruiting people and getting mailing lists and phone numbers and all this. My job was to find a place for the school. So we looked all around, and there were some old World War II wooden buildings at the airport that were vacant, and I went to the county commission and asked if we could rent them, and they said no. And we looked at some big houses, and then one day somebody said, well, what about the old hospital in the south end of Brunswick? It's vacant. Well, we took a look at that, and it looks like a school. I mean, an imposing looking building. Found out it was owned by a great fellow named Mr. Gregg. Mr. Gregg had bought that building when the hospital moved, and it had just been sitting vacant for years. But he loved that building, and he was anxious to get something in there. So we thought, well, this could work. It was in a mess. We'd have to fix it up. And he said, how much would you pay me? I said, Mr. Craig, we don't have any money. But I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll pay you so much per month per student. So if we have 100 students, you get $100 a month. And if it's 200, you get 200. And anyway, that appealed to him. So we struck a deal. And then the question came, we got to get it ready. And I was having a meeting with Judge Killian, and he said, well, right next door is the man to do it, Bill Stewart, who is a local accountant. I said, well, what does he know about getting the schools ready? He said, well, probably nothing, but he's pretty good organizer. So it was pouring down rain, worse than today, and so my wife and I went next door to Bill Stewart. I'd never met him before. And I explained what we were up to, and he knew the building. He had grown up in Brunswick. He said, oh, it's a fine building, needs a lot of work. And I said, well, could you get it ready? He said, yeah, I'll do that. Just sort of offhanded. I said, well, you don't know what you're getting into. He said, oh, I think I can do it. So that began that process. We would go over there every afternoon late, and with trucks and bins and vans, and haul trash out. We were knocking down walls, creating classrooms out of hospital rooms, which were small, and we needed more space. And Bill was coordinating it. Several other families joined in. My other assignment is to figure out who's going to run this thing. So we discovered that one of our people who we'd been meeting with, A.V. Medlin, ran a stationery shop in St. Simon's. But we discovered he also had a master's degree in education administration. Well, that sounded pretty good to us.
Yeah, that's pretty lucky right there.
Pretty lucky. I said, well, so we talked to A.V., and he said, well, I got to run my business, but I think I can just kind of run them both, and I'll do it. So by that time, I thought, well, we're getting the pieces are falling into place. And so from that moment on, I had no idea that we would not be successful. I just said, well, we're just going to do this. And somehow we all put up some money, not much, maybe $1,000 a piece. We signed a note at the bank for $20,000, I think, and that we could borrow against. But as a matter of fact, we never had to use that borrowing capacity. So all the winter and summer, we worked on the school. A.V. was buying books, buying furniture, interviewing teachers. Looking back, it was kind of a leap of faith, but I didn't realize it at the time. It seemed like a natural thing to do. Meantime, my wife was right behind us every minute, encouraging us, and she said, oh yeah, we can do this, it'll work, don't worry about it. So I was signing teacher contracts for a school we didn't have. We were buying furniture to put in a building that wasn't ready for it. We were buying books for students who we didn't have, and we were getting all this stuff done. And that was kind of the way it started out. It was just a step-by-step process. We had too much confidence. I think if I'd been a little older and a little wiser, I would have thought about it, but seemed like the thing to do. And as a matter of fact, the more we went into this process, the more people would join with us. So that was encouraging.
I'd love to hear about some of the people in the community that first helped you get this off the ground, and some of the more pivotal figures that were involved in bringing the school to life and forming the first board and
right.
Helping you make this into a reality. Do you remember any names?
Well, the main person at that stage of the game was Bill Stewart. Mm-hmm. He got things organized. He got the building ready. We hauled tons of trash out, knocked walls down, painted, and I remember we'd go down and paint the doors, and parents were doing it themselves. Billy Killian, who was the judge, was a big factor. Billy would go down. I remember Billy sitting on the floor painting in the afternoons. A very distinguished young judge. Don Gammon, who was an accountant, was keeping track of the money somehow. I never concerned myself with the money because Don said he'd look after it. So there were just lots of people over the years who would, at a critical time, would come forward. And of course, A.V. was the headmaster. His wife, Pat, was a teacher, and she knew a lot of the local teachers, so we were able to recruit some really well thought of teachers to start with. So that gave us a lot of credibility. And I don't know, I could name a dozen people, but
absolutely sure. It's interesting to note that once this board was put together and everyone was gung-ho about getting the school off the ground, one of your first meetings said, "Acceptance shall not be determined by race or color, and that there shall be no discrimination in all school policies." And I thought that was incredible, seeing as though at the time that the school was founded, a lot of private schools were being founded for the sole sake of perpetuating segregation in the South. But you guys had such a inclusive and learning forward environment over something that perpetuated hate. And I want to know what kind of led you guys to come to that conclusion of full acceptance in a time that wasn't defined by it?
Well, it was a very natural thing with the group we were dealing with. We were aware of all these segregation academies that were springing up, and we said, we just don't want to be one of those. We're here for a superior educational experience. And so that's one reason there was no big debate over it. It was just, let's just write that down, make sure everybody understands what we're about. And so that was almost a non-event as far as
I love the simplicity of it. It's a no-brainer. And when you guys first started out, in your first year, there were 108 students. It's a lot for a first year of a school. And I was wondering, how did you guys get so much interest in such a brand new event for the community?
Well, I think there was a pent-up demand. As I said, there'd been some discussion over the years about a private school, and it just had not developed. So I think there was some pent-up demand. I think my wife and her group of ladies had been really working hard, calling people, getting the news out that we were doing this. And I just think it was just a very interesting time. The timing was right to do it. And so it was really nice to see such a response. The other thing that was fascinating to me was how responsive the parents were to pitching in and helping with things. It was hot that summer and fall, and somebody said, I'm just going to get an air conditioner and put it in my child's room. Well, somebody else said, well, I'll do that too. Before I knew it, the whole place had these individual air conditioners in it. And just as things came up, people would step forward and say, this is something we need to do. And there was an unbelievable amount of response from the parents to help things along.
That's great. And moving forward from the origin in downtown Brunswick and the hospital building, how did you guys end up here on this fantastic campus? What spawned that?
Well, from the start, we decided that I was affiliated with Sea Island Company. And I said, we are not going to make this a Sea Island school. We love them, but we don't want to try to come across as being some sort of an exclusive resort outgrowth. So we kept the Sea Island Company out of it pretty much. The hospital property was wonderful in the early days, but it just wasn't big enough. Building wasn't big enough. There were no grounds. You couldn't have much of a playground. So
it's a good problem to have.
Yeah,
it's a great problem to have.
we were growing, and so I said, well, I think maybe now is the time to approach Sea Island Company. They were very supportive of the school. They realized that having a quality school was good for the community, was probably good for their business, and so I approached them about some land on St. Simon's, and they said, well, you tell us what you want. They were very responsive, so we selected this site, got an initial gift of 25 acres, and proceeded to move forward. A good friend of mine, Bob Laughlin, who had grown up on Sea Island, had moved back to town, was in the building business. His partner, Jerry Garrison, was a fine architect. So I talked to them. I said, would you fellows be interested in designing and building a school? They said, yeah, we'd love that. So we sort of got in the sand and drew it out with our foot in the dirt, the basic concept. And so we hired Garrison and Laughlin to build the initial school, and moved over here. And it was very controversial because the people in Brunswick were just very jealous of it was their school, and you moving our school. And we said, well, we've run out of space. We just got to move. So we lost a lot of people in that process, but we gained some people on St. Simon's. So it was the thing to do, and it worked out.
And obviously, Frederica has grown up a lot since that initial gift from Sea Island, and you guys actually had a lot of interesting records and events that you guys used to hold. There was the county's tallest flagpole. You guys had the Beefing Up raffle for the library. The 8th graders used to visit Governor Jimmy Carter back in the day. And I was wondering, are there any interesting stories or events that might surprise some of the current Frederica families that they might not know about?
Well, you know, we tried to do some fun things and also some educational things. For instance, we formed the first National Honor Society in Glenn County, which is surprising. There just wasn't one until we started it, and the public schools followed suit. We were living from hand to mouth financially, and decided at one point we needed to raise some money. So they said, okay, we'll get a fundraising consultant in. I said, oh, for heaven's sakes, we don't need that. We'll just go talk to these people. They said, no, you got to have a pro. So I fought them all the way, but finally the board prevailed, and we hired a fellow, a company. And as it turned out, he was my best friend by the time this thing was over. He did a wonderful job. His main purpose was to organize and also to raise the expectations of everybody. For instance, I think we were trying to raise maybe $250,000, which was all the money in the world in those years. And he said, to be successful, somebody's got to give $50,000. I said, oh my goodness. He said, so we went through the list, and we finally landed on one family that we thought could do it. So he said, you just got to go ask him. I said, okay. So I was very apprehensive, but I went to this fellow and talked to him. He'd been very supportive of the school, had children in the school. I said, Joe, somebody's got to give $50,000. And I can't think of anybody but you who can do it. I think you're the man. It's a long silence, and he said, yeah, I think you're right. I'll do it. Well, I almost fell out of my chair, and that was one of the highlights of the early days. Then the consultant came to me, and he said, now you've got to energize the board, and so you've got to give $20,000. I said, $20,000? Good grief. I mean, that's way too much. He said, well, everybody is looking at $1,000. So you go to them and say, we need your help. And they say, yeah, I'll give you $1,000. We want those people to give $10,000 or $5,000. We want to raise everybody's expectation. And he said, as the chairman, you've got to set the pace. I said, well, okay, I'll do it somehow or other. And I agreed to do it. The campaign went forward. We exceeded our goal. It was a very successful campaign. And that was my first contact with professional fundraisers. And I've had some contacts since then, and it's a special group of people, and they know what they're doing, and if you listen to them, you'll be successful. So that was an interesting time. Some years later, a fellow named Bill Brewster took over as headmaster. Bill Brewster I think he was a retired colonel. His father had started Woodward Academy, or was the head of Woodward Academy.
I'm actually alum of Woodward.
Oh, you really?
Middle school. Yes, sir.
Well, maybe you heard of Colonel Brewster.
I absolutely have.
He was a no-nonsense guy, and he came in and he said, yeah, I'll take that job, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to eliminate this debt. I said, oh gosh. So we started another fundraising campaign. He came up with a bare bones budget, C. Allen had given us some additional land that we were not using. He said, let's see if they'll buy it back. So we went to them and they said, yeah, the land we gave you, we'll buy it back. So they put some money up, and they gave it to us again some years later, over about where the baseball field is now. But Colonel Brewster shaped us up, got us out of debt, and really was he's one of the people that came along at a special time and just did a great job and helped the school. So I didn't know you would, but that's interesting.
Yes, sir.
About this time, I had been chairman of the board for 8 or 9 years, and I thought, well, it's time for somebody else to do this job. I loved what I was doing, but I felt like they were relying too much on me. And when something would come up, some question would come to the board, they'd all look at me, and I said, well, that's just not right. So I realized that the whole thing had changed. It started out very simply, and we said, well, we're gonna educate our children. Anybody else wants to come along, they're welcome. But it was a sort of a selfish attitude in a way, and but after a while, it took on a life of its own. It became really something much bigger than we had ever anticipated. And it was just great to see how it was growing. So that's when I stepped back and let another group come in, and it prospered, but it's prospered ever since, with some ups and downs, but it still has I think a very, very strong foundation, and the purpose is right, and I think people are beginning to accept it. We had a long period of time where local people were a little leery of accepting Frederica Academy. They had gone to Glenn Academy, which was a fine school, and if it was good enough for them, it's good enough for their children. And they had a strong loyalty to Glenn Academy. Then Brunswick High came along, and that began to dilute some of the loyalty. And then when we came along, it took a long time for them to really accept us, because Glenn Academy was free and this was expensive. So that's a big hurdle to get over.
Yeah. And having spent 5 decades involved with this school, and are very involved, or as a passive bystander watching it continue to prosper over time, I'm sure you've got a few really just wonderful memories that stick out in your head of the school growing up, or just something kind of funny. So I was wondering if you wanted to share some interesting memory that you've had.
Well, it's all been interesting. I can't think of anything that was funny about it. So interesting thing is, you get up and go to work, come to the meetings, watch it happen, and you can't really philosophize very much. It's a matter of dealing with whatever the problem is today. Solve that problem. There's another one waiting for you, and so it's just a fascinating thing to be involved in starting a school. And I've often said that I get way too much credit for it. There were literally hundreds of people that made huge contributions, both talent, treasure, treasure and time to make the school what it is today. And it's grown far beyond anything I envisioned.
I'm sure. I'm really sure. And now today you've had 2 children and 4 grandchildren graduate from this school. And how do you think they've benefited from their Frederica experiences?
Well, they've all turned out okay, and I think the school has given them a good, solid foundation. I've got a great grandchild that I hope is going to be here someday soon, and I got a couple of other great grandchildren who are on the way. So I'm looking forward to another generation of
Must be exciting.
people to educate.
Do you have any future hopes and dreams to see Frederica continue to prosper into the future?
No, I just think if they just need to keep what they're doing, hold firm to the ideals that they started with, and work hard. It's hard work, and it's a tough thing to go through this pandemic, but I think they'll come out of that stronger than they went in.
Oh, I agree. I agree completely.
So it's just great to see, though.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any final words of advice for our current students and families?
No, just determine what's important. I mean, my wife determined what was important for our family, and that was educating our children. I can't think of anything more important. So I think as long as we have people that recognize that and will support what they're doing here, we'll just be fine.
That's awesome. Mr. Benefield, that's all I have for you. It's been an honor commemorating 50 years since the beginning of this great, great school. I'm glad to be a part of it. I'm glad that you started it. So, with
Well,
that,
thank you, James. It's been a lot of fun.
yes, sir. Thank you.
James, let me ask you one final question. What are your plans for college, and what do you think has been the best experience you've had at Frederica Academy?
Well, that is a fantastic question. I moved around schools a good bit before I came to Frederica and settled down here in St. Simons. I'm originally from North Georgia and came down here kind of on a whim. And without a doubt, not a singular doubt, Frederica has been my favorite stop so far. I've made a really great family here, a lot of great friends. I love my teachers. I very much respect and admire Mr. Temple, and I think it's very much prepared me for the road ahead. But I have big plans for my future. My future's really bright because I came here and I flourished in this environment. And, I'm looking at several really great colleges that, 4 years ago I probably wouldn't have envisioned myself at. And I've found several passions and hobbies here that I don't know if I would have been able to find them otherwise. And truthfully, I'm indebted to your service to the community and my teacher services to the community today for kind of setting me up for what's to come next. So I appreciate that. And, Frederica's done a lot for me.
Well, that makes it all worthwhile.
Absolutely.